Mohamed Khairullah has served as mayor of Prospect Park, New Jersey for more than 12 years. Does that mean you're in your fourth term?
I'm running for my fourth term this year.
Okay. And you left your homeland of Syria in 1980. So you understand, Mayor Khairullah understands full well the meaning of fascism and state-sponsored terror under the Assad regime. And then coming here to the States, you embraced opportunities, albeit not perfect, but nonetheless opportunities for political engagement and grassroots activism. Since the start of the Civil War, he's traveled to Syria
Revolution.
Thank you. Since the start of the Syrian Revolution, Mayor Khairullah has traveled to Syria 7 times with the Syrian American Medical Society, delivering food, medical and school supplies, and helping equip underground medical facilities. He speaks locally, nationally, and globally on forced migration and the plight of refugees, and also the need for civic engagement and responsibility. So thank you for being here, Mayor Khairullah.
Thank you.
Could you start by telling us where you were born and what was going on that caused you to flee Syria in 1980?
Yeah. Thank you. First of all, thank you, Susan, and thank you to Peace Action for hosting us to find out more about how you could help the Syrian people. So my family fled Syria in 1980 during what I call the first uprising against the Assad regime. And that happened about 8 years after Assad, the father, took full control of the government. Started about 1978. And my family had to flee as my grandfather was one of the major clerks in the city of Aleppo. He was very involved in the movement, and at one point he had to flee for his life, and so did my father, and my other grandfather came to the United States. So one fled to Saudi Arabia, and one fled to the US. And I was raised in Saudi Arabia for about 11 years before coming to the United States. But the one thing that I should bring up is having to flee Syria really before I was even 5 years old created that resentment in me against the Assad regime, which I think is critical in seeing the overall picture. Because if you look at the number of people who fled Syria when it wasn't destroyed as much, basically they destroyed the city of Hama in 1982 and killed 40,000 people in 1 month, and that basically ended the first uprising. But when you look at the extent of this conflict and the forced migration of millions of people, the destruction of basically, if you look at the city of Aleppo, half of the city, and if you look at different parts of the country, whether it's in Homs or whether it's in Damascus, the amount of destruction, the use of illegal weapons on civilians, the fact that the entire world basically stood silently in the world of digital media, I think creates a lot more resentment, which eventually is going to come back as a tsunami at one point. And I think we need to take that into consideration when we talk about how do you bring peace to Syria. And peace in Arabic is salam, but what they want the Syrian people is to do istislam, or submission. They want to submit. They want the Syrian people to submit to the Assad regime, basically. So even if we call it peace right now, even if they burn East Ghouta and then they target the last stronghold, which is the Idlib area, so even if the Assad regime has full control, it's never going to be, if it becomes submission or istislam, there will never be inside the Syrian people that salam. There might be a peaceful time where things will calm down, but there are millions of people who want to come back to their homelands, just like at one point I wanted to go back to my homeland, as whether it was as a teenager or early on in my years here in the US. I've always dreamed about going back, but obviously now I have a family and I established my life here. But I do want for the Syrian people, I do want for my family there, the same type of lifestyle that I have here. The ability to speak freely without having to fear, as I had said, that walls are listening, that someone is spying on you, that any word you say, whether in a taxi or a public place, you might have someone knock on your door and you might go disappearing for a very long time, if not forever. So that's the background which made me want to go and help. And it resulted in my first trip into Syria in December of 2012 and followed with 6 more trips. The significant thing about me going back and forth is I could see the transition of the situation on the ground, that because I'm separated from it, then I come back. And sometimes, I used to come in the beginning every 3 to 4 months, then it started becoming twice a year. And you could see how things changed. First visit, for example, it was all about how do we provide bread to the people, Second visit is, all right, people have established themselves, they're a civil society, there's actually local government that's established by the Syrian people outside of the control of the Assad regime. So the idea that no one can rule Syria other than Assad is unacceptable to me, because the Syrian people have demonstrated the ability to rule regions outside of the control of the Assad regime. Until the Assad regime decided to release, as mentioned before, the radicals into society and basically gave them the ability to roam around, and that was the creation of ISIS. So in 2013, I think it was my summer visit, you start seeing the writings on the walls of ISIS slogans inside Syria. Then I go in the winter of 2013, and now civilians and activists are afraid to speak on camera. I can't interview people anymore because ISIS now has become stronger inside Syria, and now they're starting to target, rather than targeting the regime, they're targeting civil activists. So you see the mindset behind releasing these radicals is let them loose on these activists. So if someone, excuse me if I use you as an example, if she's not covered and she's an activist, they don't care how good she's doing.
Well, actually,
I've been once in their prisons.
Okay, so then she becomes an infidel, right? If I come from the United States.
Because she was driving.
Oh, okay, so yeah. I mean, I remember, I walked into Macy's yesterday, and there were 2 mannequins that were completely naked, and I joked with my wife, because, I met her in Syria. I said, these two mannequins could get their heads chopped if they were in Syria, in the ISIS areas. It was funny, because you would go to the markets where areas are controlled by ISIS or radicals, and they have the heads of the mannequins covered in plastic bags. That's how silly they are. I mean, their minds are just thinking about the silliest things. So until they were kicked out of Aleppo by the rebels who are now fighting the regime, and they have to protect themselves from ISIS, and and then afterward things started going backward for the revolutionaries, because now the regime brought in the airplanes as mentioned, then they brought in Hezbollah, then they brought in Iran, then when they couldn't handle the will of the Syrian people, now they brought the Russians to implement the scorched earth policy. So I think in the long term can there be peace? Yes, but I think number one, the head of the snake in Syria, the Assad regime, needs to be removed. I mean, you're talking about a regime that right now, they just released a list of 1.5 million people who they want to come to their intelligence services. You're talking about a regime now with their alliance with Iran is systematically changing the demographics of certain areas of Aleppo so they could have a stronger support base, because they know that the current majority in Syria will never support them. So I'll leave it there, and I'll take your questions.
Yeah, with two questions. When you would travel, starting in 2012, would you go into Lebanon and then go by land and primarily to Aleppo? And also, Aleppo now, I mean, you talk about the difference between Islam peace and Islam submission. Aleppo now is under submission by the Assad regime with the government of Iran, and you see murals of Bashar al-Assad and Ayatollah Khamenei everywhere. There are Iranian schools being set up, and there is a semblance of stability. People are able to breathe and eat, but is this submission sustainable? So if you could talk about your journeys into Aleppo and if this is sustainable.
Yeah, well, I'll share with you a few of the visuals. When I walk inside destroyed neighborhoods, and what I see walking inside apartments in a building, a breakfast tray left with dried olives, dried bread, or walking into a house seeing a pile of bread, or seeing the frames of college degrees. You're basically seeing people at a moment's notice having to basically abandon the life they're used to. They're abandoning maybe a home that they were born in, or a home they created a family in. So it was very painful, obviously, in terms of the imagery, and then the destruction itself. You go into entire neighborhoods where probably tens of thousands of people used to live, and now it's a ghost town. I think there's got to be a lot of healing to be done when it comes to that.
Well, the topic of the panel is ending the conflict and bringing peace to Syria. I know that with SAMS, the Syrian American Medical Society, you're trying to do that. Mm-hmm. So tell us about SAMS, and also what more needs to be done.
Yeah. Well, SAMS focus on the medical aspect of helping the Syrians inside Syria and around Syria. And now they've become such a trusted international organization that they have set up operation in Bangladesh helping the Rohingyas. And I was there with them last November. But as you mentioned, SAMS now have resorted to building underground hospitals, fortified underground hospital, not only going into a basement of a building. I share with you that in 2015, I visited the underground hospital that I helped establish in Aleppo, and it was one of the last two hospitals left in Aleppo before the complete takeover by the regime, that they couldn't get it with their rockets, that they started attacking it with chlorine, because chlorine actually settles to low in the ground. So SAMS have helped over 3 million people a year for the past 2 years inside and outside Syria. The overall cost of helping a patient by SAMS is probably less than $10 a patient. Their budget is close to $28 million, and obviously they need the support of donors. So even a $10 donation could help a patient. Another organization I do want to bring up is obviously SAC, or the Syrian American Council, because they do a lot of advocacy on Capitol Hill. There is actually a caucus in Congress called the Syrian Caucus, with about 20-something Congress people who work with SAC, the Syrian American Council, advocating for Syria. So I think we need to constantly talk to our elected officials and let them know that we need to be serious about bringing stability to Syria. The Assad regime is a paper tiger. It could only use force on its own people. And we really don't have to use force with them. But if they ever felt that there's actually a real threat of force on the regime itself, on its facilities, on the presidential palace, for example, then they would stop. But no one at any point has been serious about stopping the Assad regime, because at one point when the conflict became a militarized one and countries started intervening inside Syria, everyone intervened for their own purpose and therefore for their own strategic interest. So it was never about the Syrian people, obviously, as far as I'm concerned. Even the latest call by President Trump right now to pull out of Syria, it's really not about the Syrian people. It's not even about the American people, as far as I'm concerned. It's either a threat to Iran to see what we could do with the nuclear deal, or it's a threat to Saudi Arabia to see if we could get more money out of them, as he very clearly specified.
Right. Well, at the same time, as Trump is saying, we completed our mission in eradicating the Islamic State, and we're going to bring our troops home from Syria. The U.S. Central Command head is saying that the work in Syria just started. So it's very much a mixed message.
He could put a banner on a Air Force carrier, just like Bush, and we know where that is right now.
Yeah.
Mission accomplished. That's a very familiar scene.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mayor Khairullah.